Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's webcast, Boosting Business Productivity by Taking Control of Microsoft Teams Performance. I'm your host, Microsoft MVP, Nick Cavalancia, and I'm joined today by Rob Doucette. He's the VP of Product Development at Martello. Rob, we've done a couple of these webcasts together. I'm glad you're here. Thanks for joining me again today.
Yeah, glad to be here. Thanks, Nick.
Yep, and just a couple of housekeeping items for those of you that are listening. The webinar today is being recorded, and you will be sent a link to the recording afterwards. Also, usually some people ask about the slides through these webinars, and at the end of the webinar today, there will be a survey, and as part of that survey, there's a checkbox there somewhere to say, I'd like to get a copy of the slides. If you'd like those as well, we'd go ahead and do it that way. And the one last thing here is the format for today's webcast is a little different. This isn't death by PowerPoint. Rob and I have not built out 40 slides to cover in the next 30 minutes. I think there's a total of 8, maybe 9 slides, something like that total. And this is a bit more of a conversational format between Rob and myself. I want you all to think of the slide as more of a visual indicator of what we're talking about, rather than them being necessarily the complete focus of your attention. And then since this is a conversation, I do have it. I'm clicking it open right now. The Q&A box here. Make sure that I have that open all the time in case you happen to have a question or a comment or an anecdote or something you just care to share during our conversation today. Would love to include you in on that. And then, as always, there'll be some formal Q&A time at the very end of today's webcast. So let's kind of jump in here first by looking at the agenda that we have. And I want to talk a little bit about why productivity, specifically in teams, kind of starts with the user experience and why that's important. It's really going to be kind of the crux of where some of these metrics that we're going to utilize to boost performance are going to come from. And then we'll talk about what metrics you can use to try and take control of that productivity in teams. And then we're going to break those out into specific technologies just to get a better sense of how you can dig a little deeper. It's great to have, let's say, some kind of high-level metric, but if you want to go deeper than that, how do you do that and what kind of technology is necessary? And then we'll talk a little bit about some next steps, and we'll do some Q&A at the end. So the place we'll start today is just this idea of why does the idea of boosting teams' business productivity start with user experience? And so I tend to think of the productivity all really has to do a lot with how the user works with teams, how productive they can be by using teams. A couple of examples here. If you've got a great call quality, you've got a real productive call, right? And you're able to get a lot of work done because no one's focusing on anything but the conversation being had. But if there's a jittery call and it's, oh, wait, what'd you say? What was that? Rob, I didn't hear you quite. What? Did you repeat that? Obviously, we're not productive. And that's kind of the idea, just a real simple function like that. The user experience that they have with something like Teams being so important, that kind of defines productivity. So what's necessary here is to identify whether the user is having any kind of quality issues. And that's where these metrics we're going to talk about today kind of come into play. If we can figure out who is having quality issues, then we can figure out who is being productive or not. And then at a macro level, kind of figure out whether or not there's an overall issue for the organization or for one particular location or something along those lines. Now, Teams is multifaceted in a couple of ways. One is how you use it. Some people just do calls. Some people are doing the collaborative stuff. Some people are using the chat. Some people store files there. Some people use the integration. At the same time, behind the scenes, Teams is made up of Exchange Online and SharePoint Online and OneDrive, which is kind of the same thing, but neither here nor there. But there's a lot of back-end stuff that goes on that makes up Teams. And so that becomes kind of the problem. We're going, well, what should I be paying attention to? Because of the fact that I'm not exactly sure where in Teams is the issue. And so you really need some context on a couple things here. The first one is around that service delivery. That is the user experiential kind of things that the user is interacting with Teams, whether it's calls or collaboration or uploading files or whatever it is, understand that service delivery. Then thinking about the quality of that service. So for delivery, just did I get it? Is it working? Quality is how good is it working? And the last one is understanding who's impacted, what parts of Teams are they impacted by, what isn't working specifically, maybe even why, if you're doing root cause analysis, and how do you go about fixing it is the idea here. And so what you're going to need here is you're going to need some performance metrics. Now, Rob, the first place I think we can start our conversation is just with this idea of going beyond the concept of uptime. And I've just got a couple of notes here that maybe we can have a little bit of a discussion about this. if you think about the service availability of the overall platform, or even specific services within Microsoft 365's cloud, that's not a performance metric. That's an availability metric. It's just telling you it's up or it's down. Now, certainly, if it's down, there's no performance. I get it, but it's not telling you how well is it functioning. It's just telling you if it is or isn't. So it gives you that kind of initial high-level metric of we're getting some service delivery to some degree, but we're not necessarily sure how well or how big of a degree we're getting it. So the idea is you've got to dig a little deeper. And Rob, where I'd like to start is this idea of a MOS score. And rather than me covering it, I'd rather ask you, would you talk about this a little bit and talk to the audience about why this MOS score is kind of so important?
Yeah, definitely. So I think, the first point you made is a great one, right around service availability. We've talked a bit about that in some of our previous webinars, but that's sort of what Microsoft publishes in terms of their end of responsibility, which is lacking. But at the same time, you can understand that that's all Microsoft has control over, so that's all they're going to really publish, and it gives you that. Well, is the thing even on? Before I go further, from a Teams perspective, MOS is providing a similar top-level metric, if you will, right? You talked about the multifaceted nature of Teams, right? There's a lot of things you could look at to understand if Teams is working, but where can I start at a more simple level? And that's where MOS, or Mean Opinion Score, is a great place to start. It's a 1 to 5 metric. It's going to give you a very simplistic view of how well are Teams calls functioning for your users. If the MOS score is low, if we're having a Teams call and the MOS is 3, let's say, we know that call will have been perceived to have been a poor call. We may not know why yet, what the details and all the performance pieces underneath of it, but it's a great leading indicator that, hey, there's something going on here, that this isn't a great experience, and it's worth digging in to see, well, what else is behind this.
I like that because it's still providing those in the audience some kind of a high-level idea, rather than getting lots of red flags from very specific granular metrics. Instead, it's let's look at the high level. Is the user having a good experience with calls, with Teams, or not? It's a great leading indicator, if you will, of if there's an issue. Now, we can go a little deeper than that, because I know, Rob, that the MOS score is made up of a number of different technical factors. And so I've got a couple of these here, things like packet loss, jitter, and round trip time. And I thought maybe we talk about those both, maybe you could talk about how they both contribute to MOS, and then talk about them individually as well, and how that provides a little more visibility by sort of unpeeling the onion and looking deeper into the performance metrics.
Yeah, definitely. So MOS score, that 1 to 5 measurement typically is a calculation that's derived from the metrics that you've just shown: packet loss, jitter, and round trip time. And the type of performance problem we experience in the call will be surfaced by one of those metrics, right? You described a jittery call in the previous slide, where you're getting some audio distortion and you can't really understand what someone's saying. On the delay or round trip time front, probably the most frustrating aspect of a poor call, where you're talking over one another because you wait for a second and then you start talking, and oh no, the other person's talking, and that delay, even a few hundred milliseconds, can cause a quite a frustrating experience. So while the MOS score gives us the indicator that, hey, there's something that we should look into here, the deeper inspection around packet loss and jitter and delay can give us some indications as to okay, well, what actually is happening. And it can give us some clues as to, is it a bandwidth problem? Is it a headset problem? It gives us some information to get to the next level.
Yeah, and the interesting thing here for you in the audience is you're going, this is kind of great, but this is only really one part of Teams. We're just talking about calls, and that's it. And really, like I said, Teams is multifaceted. And so I wanted to start here by just kind of using this example with all of you to kind of make the case that having metrics like this, so starting with service availability at a very high level, and you go kind of one level deeper, going, well, what if I want to just focus on calls? You got your MOS, and you take a look at MOS, a great leading indicator, far better indicator of experience, how well the user is being, and therefore how productive they are. But then you might need to have to go even deeper. But this, again, is only one part of Teams. And the reality is you need even more visibility into Teams than just these metrics here. And so what I want to do, Rob, is I've got a couple slides to talk about some different kinds of technology. Now, um, for those in the audience, I want to try to make this as vendor neutral as possible, so this isn't like a half an hour pitch, because nobody really wants to sit through those webcasts. But we're going to use Martello as an example. So I'm going to cover a couple of different kinds of monitoring that are available today, both from Martello and other companies. And Rob, I'm going to ask you, maybe you would just provide some examples of how the specific technologies can be used and the kinds of metrics that you can get out of teams to help identify whether there are service delivery issues and therefore performance issues, which therefore means productivity issues within different parts of teams, if you will. So I'm going to start with the first one here, which is synthetic monitoring. Now, excuse me, synthetic monitoring is a concept where rather than you're watching, let's say, a specific user or a set of users, like really like exactly what Johnny, Sally, and Bobby are doing, there's a bot that's used, a robot, if you will, that is installed on a system that represents, let's say, an entire office, or everyone that connects via Wi-Fi at that office, or everyone connects through the wired network at that office, or it could be a region. It just represents a group of individuals. And that specific bot, what it's doing is it's interacting with actually all of Office 365, but since we're talking about Teams today, we'll just focus on Teams, but it interacts with Teams, synthesizing real user transactions with Teams. So uploading a file, starting a call, scheduling something, those kind of things. So you're getting this synthetic monitoring. It's synthetic because it's not actually what Bobby, Sally, and Johnny, or whatever the names were, that they're experiencing, but it's supposed to represent what they're experiencing. And that way you get a really good leading indicator of something that might be impacting a lot of users, so that you know the severity of it, because you know that, let's say, a particular monitor represents the entire Los Angeles office and there are 150 people there. Now you know that 150 people might be having an issue. So Rob, I've kind of given an example here. Now I've got one of your screenshots up here. Can you kind of talk a little bit more about synthetic monitoring and provide some examples here of how you might kind of get some metrics that'll help more than just the call quality type of metrics in Teams?
Yeah, definitely. So you teed that up nicely. This robot that Nick has described that's performing these synthetic transactions, the real benefit here, while it's not representative of a particular user's behavior or experience, it does give you a proactive view, right? That's the real benefit around synthetic transactions, is that this thing is running all the time, regardless of whether somebody is actually having Teams calls and looking for problems in advance of somebody noticing, right? So it gives IT the chance of getting ahead of that, and we could detect problems, whether it's regional or global problems with Microsoft. We use, you're using that example of maybe being in an LA office, right? Is there something wrong with the ISP that's being used from that office? Is there something with the local network in that office? All these things can be detected proactively before anybody else notices. IT gets notified, and they can fix this problem before somebody actually goes and then has a bad experience and calls and complains. And that MOS score that we talked about is kind of front and center here on the chart. But we go to the next level of detail as well, right? With showing you the detailed metrics behind it, but also very specific actions. So Nick described that Teams is very multifaceted, both on its dependency on other parts of the stack like OneDrive and SharePoint Online and Exchange Online, but also in terms of how users interact and use it. Right, so we hear from, for example, just an anecdote from some of our larger financial or banking customers. This isn't just an internal tool, but they're using Teams to interact with clients. And if that experience isn't great on both sides, the client rather is going to perceive that as they're going to leave that call thinking of it's going to taint the experience of the bank, right? Even though the bank, of course, had nothing to do with a lot of the things that were involved with delivering that Teams experience to the user. It is critical. So just having the Teams view is one thing, right? Saying that here's the MOS score, but these robot users can also do the same level of actions on the OneDrive front, on the SharePoint Online front, on the Exchange Online front. So all those pieces that need to, work in tandem, we have visibility so that if there is a Teams problem, we can point out that, well, we also see that there's problems uploading content into OneDrive, or there's some slowness in a SharePoint page, and a lot of that stuff is being grouped into Teams. So you really have to have that full perspective to understand what's going on.
I'd add to that, just having had some experience with this. Another factor that you haven't really talked about yet, that's just been kind of touched on, is the idea of, like, let's say, authentication. A user, all of you in the audience, we've all experienced this. A user calls up and just says, Teams isn't working. What does that mean? Right? And instead, it actually means like they can't actually authenticate. It might be the problem. We've actually seen that with Microsoft, where the authentication services went down, but Teams and SharePoint and OneDrive, all those things were up and running or fine. It was actually an issue with authentication. So even something like that, and understanding not just the Teams specific stuff. And I love the example you're talking about, Rob, of just seeing that maybe Teams is having a problem, but also OneDrive is, and so on. And seeing that correlation, it ends up being some very powerful visibility. While it's not a specific metric that we've really mentioned here, I think it does at least paint a picture that by having visibility into how everything is performing in each of those functions, and those metrics really become, I think in this case of synthetic monitoring, become the can I copy a file up for the sake of argument, and how long does that take, or those kinds of things. It's really more about what are you doing, not so much the a metric like we'd be thinking about, like packet loss rate or something on those lines. Would you agree?
Yeah, oh yeah, totally, exactly.
All right, so let's talk about the next one here, which is real user monitoring. And real user monitoring, or RUM sometimes as it's called, is implemented in a couple of different ways. Some organizations go about it, or I should say vendors go about it, by putting, let's say, an agent on a machine. I've seen others where it's actually just a browser extension, and they're just watching purely browser-based interaction with Office 365, or in our case, of course, Teams. So there's lots of ways of doing it, but the goal here is to, instead of using the, how do I say this right? Okay, well, synthetic monitoring, I can't speak today. We're looking at more of a representation of some subset of users, which, by the way, you could, in theory, use synthetic monitoring to represent an individual. It just means you'd have to have, for example, if your CEO was working from home, you'd have to have, like, let's say, a laptop in his or her home as well, with a synthetic monitoring going on, just to represent them. So kind of keep that in mind. You could represent a single user. It's just not entirely practical, especially not for everyone. But we're doing real user monitoring. We're really talking about, you can see in the screenshot here, like, how is Amanda working? Is she able to function or not? And so in this case, it's a little bit of a different focus. We're really trying to figure out whether an individual user is having a problem. And that can be important to know if any of your C-suite or some other exec, whatever it is, or someone who's a really important user that's working on a project that's got a high deadline, something, you have a better review into that. Rob, would you talk a little bit about, maybe some of the ways that you guys do real user monitoring and how that's different, and then some of the metrics that are going to help provide some visibility here?
Yeah, definitely. So, I mean, while there is a benefit to some of the deployment models you mentioned, right? Having an agent on everyone's laptop or endpoint, having a browser extension, there are clear benefits to having that, but it does also complicate the deployment and the security model and things, and that can slow down the organization's ability to get that data quickly and effectively. So the approach that we've taken here is we're able to consume quite a bit of data that Microsoft publishes about Teams call quality data, user and device information through some of their graph APIs. And the nice thing is, from an organization perspective, they just need to provide credentials into their tenant, and we can get pretty rich information about real user data with respect to Teams calls, meetings, user activity, that sort of thing. And this is the use case where, out of the gate, you just kind of want to know what's actually happening in my organization. Like the robot users are great for giving you that representation view and that proactive monitoring, but you need to sort of establish a baseline of, okay, where are my hotspots in my organization, which, back to what we were talking about deployment, can guide, well, maybe we should put a robot in Los Angeles and New York, but Chicago looks like everything's just singing along, no one's complaining, there's no poor calls happening, so we'll just kind of leave the agentless monitoring in place for now, because that will surface things when something goes wrong. And yet the other nice thing we see in this screenshot, we see Amanda, and she's flagged as red, and we see 3 boxes below there. We're getting some detail about the types of devices that Amanda uses. So each of those boxes on the bottom represents a different device that she is using. So when Amanda does inevitably call and complain about some poor experiences she's having, I can see that she's running a Linux machine, a Windows machine, a MacBook, and I can see that predominantly the problems seem to be originating from her calls on a MacBook. That might be not necessarily the MacBook, but it might be that she runs a MacBook when she's in the, the corner store coffee shop, or maybe what she uses at home, and that we can see along with that data, was she on a wired network, a wireless network, what bandwidth was available, what headset was she using, what ISP, what location was she in. So there's a tremendous amount of data that allows IT to respond reactively in this case. Again, we prefer that we could address everything proactively, but that's just not realistic all the time. So in this case, Amanda calls, IT can quickly search for Amanda, bring up this view, and I can see, yeah, well, it looks like these problems are stemming from this one device configuration on this network, and it looks like it's because, you just don't have enough bandwidth. So you need to, find a new place to have those meetings, or take some other action in order to improve the performance of those calls.
Wonderful, wonderful. Appreciate all that. So the last version here is SLA monitoring. And you might go, what in the world's that? Well, think about an SLA, right? You've got a service level agreement with your customers, in this case, your users. And in the case of like Teams, the SLA is, of course, about you're going to have availability to those services. But if you think about it, there's lots of parts, moving parts that exist in between, let's say, the user's endpoint and the Teams service. So just as an example, the user's endpoint is their laptop at home. They utilize a VPN to connect to the corporate office. It's got to go through a bunch of networking components. Maybe there's some security services that are scanning into a deep packet inspection or something along those lines. There's a bunch of routing that's bouncing between locations, even though you're not supposed to do that according to Microsoft. Eventually, it egresses out. It's got to go through some kind of tunnel service directly to Microsoft's cloud, and then you've got whatever's involved in Microsoft's cloud. So there's a lot of moving parts to go end to end. And service level monitoring focuses in on looking at all of those specific aspects of the connection from end to end, providing you visibility into, using the example he talked about, like Amanda might have a problem, but then what SLA monitoring can be used is to figure out, well, Amanda's actually over in the Tokyo office, and it looks like there's actually a router that's really, really slow in the Tokyo office. So now we've identified it all the way down to it being a specific router or switch or something along those lines in a specific office that's causing that problem. And so it's really about visibility across the board of services that are involved, hardware that's involved, any kind of other infrastructure, resources, anything that stands in between from one end to the other. And so the idea here is you're able to get more visibility, and then you can peel back the onion and do a bit of root cause analysis to identify where you need to place your focus. In some cases, the issue might be Microsoft, in which case the other thing you can really do is to notify your users. And that's kind of where hopefully you're probably not using SLA monitoring, but probably using more synthetic monitoring because you found out about it proactively before it impacts people. But at least you can identify where the issue is and then notify people, hey, we noticed that there's a problem with accessing Teams. It only seems to be impacting the people in the Rio de Janeiro office. Everyone else seems to be fine. We'll let you know when it comes back up, or something along those lines. But Rob, what would you add to this, and what kind of metrics should the audience expect to get from this kind of monitoring?
Yeah, that's a great background covered there. I mean, we kicked this off with the first slide. You called out the Microsoft SLA metric that they publish in the tenant, which is just a very small piece of the puzzle. And you did use some great examples in terms of all the other things that need to work in concert for us to have a good Teams experience. And organizations are looking for that true end-to-end visibility. So this provides the combination of those synthetic transactions, the real user data, as we saw with Amanda as an example. We didn't touch on in terms of screenshots, but one of the things that we can also do from a Martello portfolio perspective is bring in data from tools you're already using, things like SolarWinds and AppDynamics and ServiceNow, and bring all that data in so that we can cover the scenarios that Nick mentioned in terms of there's a router in the Los Angeles office that's problematic, or the Tokyo office that's problematic. I need to have visibility into how well those devices are performing to understand the users in that office and how well they're able to interact with Teams. So all this data comes together. We get this view here that shows a day-by-day, hour-by-hour view on how well the service is being delivered to your users. And we get detail in terms of, well, if things weren't delivered well, why not, right? And then we get some prescriptive guidance for, well, if I want to deliver a better service next week or next month, I know I need to replace that router. I need to, search for a better ISP in this particular region of the world. and then I'm assured with some confidence that, you know, if those things are fixed, I'm going to deliver a better service next month. And, you know, this is a great view that can be exported, and we can report on it and share it with, you know, executive stakeholders, or in the case of a, you know, if you're an MSP, sharing this with your customers to sort of provide proof of the value that you deliver as a service provider. You know, great use cases to be able to cover in terms of that end-to-end view.
Wonderful. So the last thing here is just to be thinking about Teams performance and how that equates to productivity. Just a couple things up top here. You're using Teams to improve productivity. In a lot of cases, organizations like yours, Teams is the office for all intents and purposes. So that's really it's trying to be productive there. And so obviously the business then becomes at stake if you're not getting Teams to work. And so you're trying to tie it back, those metrics back to the idea of boosting performance. If you look at the metrics, they indicate how well you're doing that boosting or not, if you will. And if you look at the four sort of benefits here, this deeper visibility we've been talking about, whether it's through the synthetic monitoring, through the real user monitoring, or the SLA monitoring, you can see there's a couple of issues that are issues with a couple of benefits here. So you're able to identify that there's an issue in the first place far quicker than you would just by using Microsoft. I mean, Microsoft, you think about their service availability, that's a very reactive metric. It's telling you already, hey, by the way, right now, we're down. You're already down. It's down, done. So your users are already impacted at that point by the time you find out. So by using something like, for example, synthetic monitoring, you might find that out at 6 in the morning local time at a given office, and you're able to notify users via email that Teams is down, so that way they're not inundating the help desk or service desk with calls. Then you've got this increased understanding of scope, because you can drill in deeper depending on the type of monitoring you're using. You can end up getting hopefully root cause, and then also the impact is there's that whole idea of who's impacted by it, because you can see depending on the monitoring that you're using, you have the ability to see, for example, all the way down to the user with RUM. You have down to a specific office with synthetic and that kind of thing. You have a lower mean time to resolution. Again, if you can resolve it, but it's something internal. That example of Amanda with the MacBook having a problem, maybe she's got an older client or something and it didn't update, or there's something else running. Like I know on my MacBook that I happen to have, if I run Outlook on it, it takes up a lot of the processor utilization. So maybe her issue is she's got a really slow MacBook and she has Outlook open. When she was trying to run Teams, it just doesn't perform as well. And so it really isn't a problem with anything other than something on her MacBook. You know, helps you reduce that time to resolve. And then the other thing here is to try and resolve those internal issues that helps improve the overall performance. Because you think about back to my example of it being a router or switch in the Tokyo office, that's the problem. If I can fix that, that's a permanent fix for a very long time, as opposed to being that one-off fix for something that just happens to have exist today. So with that, Rob, anything to add here? If not, I'm going to hand the floor to you, because I know you've got a couple of slides here.
No, I think you've covered it well, and I think the trend that I'll just call out here that's interesting is, you know, we're seeing and hearing from even like HR leaders that, you know, in terms of attracting talent, you know, people are asking about the tech stack. You know, what collaboration tools do you use, right? It's an important piece of happiness now for employees, right? It's not only keeping your existing employees happy, but it's also helping for your ability to hire new talent, that you have sophisticated tools, you have the ability to deliver them effectively so that people can be productive. And, you know, the tolerance for, you know, poor performing tools required for you to do your job has diminished quite a bit, right? And I think that's going to continue, especially as, you know, the younger generation, you know, takes over the workforce. There's going to be very little tolerance for this type of stuff. So it's becoming top of mind for a lot of organizations. So yeah, yeah. So, you know, just pointing out here, Martello's had a long background in the monitoring space, particularly in unified communications. You know, strong Microsoft partners. Microsoft sees the value in what we do. You know, really reinforcing that, you know, an organization invests quite a bit of money and time into the Microsoft 365 stack. You want to make sure you've got the right tools to support that and make sure you're getting all the value you can out of it. And, you know, we get some great reviews from our customers as well, that after they deployed our solution, they see that value and they continue and remain as a happy Martello customer. In terms of next steps here, so a couple actions that we would ask of the audience. So if you saw something in here that you think your organization could benefit from, we'd love to sign you up as a trial and get started with Teams monitoring. This is where we could leverage some of our RUM capabilities, real user monitoring capabilities, to give you that agentless snapshot of how well is this working in your environment today, right? The deployment is very, very low. We're not asking to deploy agents through your whole environment just to get a snapshot. We can do that really easily. You get value in the first hour of having this thing running. And then we've published an Ultimate Teams performance guide that really identifies the metrics that your IT team should be looking at to make sure that you're on top of delivering a top-notch Teams user experience. So there's a link there. You can get some great information in our performance guide.
Wonderful. It looks like we are at the bottom of the hour, but there are at least 2 questions that are here. I'm just going to go ahead and quickly do those. If you guys can stand with us, that'd be great. If you can't, we totally understand. We want to respect your time and appreciate your attendance today. Shane's asking, the 3 types of monitoring that you mentioned, are those available as one product or are those 3 products?
Great question. So it's an integrated solution. So it's one solution that we deliver. There's different additions in that solution that align to where you are in terms of the maturity of getting your arms around Teams monitoring. So the first category gives you the robust detection capability. So you're going to get the RUM capabilities we talked about. You're going to get the synthetic transaction capabilities that we talked about right out of the gate. Our second edition provides diagnostic capabilities, which we didn't really touch on today, but we have some deeper dive tools where we can get into the details of the network path in between your users and the service that they're accessing with Teams. So you can understand, is it an ISP problem? Is it a cloud proxy problem? Is it a VPN problem? That sort of thing. And that also brings in the third-party tools that we talked about as that other data source. So, that SolarWinds, PRTG, App Dynamics use case, so you can pull that data in. And then the last edition allows you to optimize that service over time, which integrate with ServiceNow, get your help desk involved and make sure they have visibility on what's going on and produce those SLA reports so that you get visibility into, what are the components that you need to resolve in order to deliver a better service and track that month over month.
The last question that came in, Kamar had asked, if I only had to use one of those 3 monitoring types, which one would I use? What's your recommendation? You had to pick one.
Yeah, so I would say the synthetics is having a proactive view of your environment would be where, if I had to pick one. Now, we really think that the RUM data is a great way to guide where you should put those synthetics. So, the power of them both being together is hard to beat because you don't really know, should I put robots in every office? Should every user be running a robot? Should only certain locations have robots? That's a difficult thing to do without having that RUM data. So, we would always recommend start with the RUM data to get that view, that sort of snapshot baseline view of what's going on, and then you can deploy robots strategically. But if you only had to pick one, the proactive view is hard to beat because you get early advance notice of these things before your users notice and often can fix them before anybody even complains.
Wonderful. I'm going to put back your next step slide here where we kind of close things out. We're about 3 minutes past our bottom of the hour for our half-an-hour webcast. So Rob, thanks for a great conversation today. I know this was short and sweet. We try to be to the point. So thanks a lot for all your input today. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Nick. It was great.
Yeah, always a good time to be together with you. Those in the audience, hope you got something out of the webcast today. I know it's kind of hard in half an hour to give you a lot of practical advice on exactly which metrics to use. I think the focus here is more so just to make sure you start thinking about diving deeper and then looking for ways to get metrics that are going to be meaningful that you can actually then respond to issues, hopefully remediate them, identify root cause, that kind of thing. At the end of the day, Microsoft does only give you so much from that perspective, which means you're going to have to be looking at third party. I mean, Microsoft is notorious for just leaving gaps for their partners, and this is just one of those examples. So I hope you got something out of today's webcast. You've got your next steps up here if you want to. If you're still typing a question, and it sounds like obviously we're finishing up here, keep typing it. Someone from Artello will reach out to you directly and make sure you get your question answered. We'll be happy to do that as well. And so with that, we're going to conclude today's webcast, and thanks a lot for your attendance.